I'm Arthur. There is a face you already know, even if you have never read a single word about the man who wore it. It has been printed on more walls and flags and shirts than almost any photograph ever taken. And here is the thing that has held on to me for years. The men who made that face immortal were not his friends. They were the men who hunted him for the better part of a year, cornered him in a dry ravine, shot him in a one-room schoolhouse, and then went to a great deal of trouble to make sure there would be nothing left of him to find. No grave, no marker, no body. They wanted him to simply stop existing. And in the strangest way a thing can fail, they failed completely. Tonight I want to walk the whole of it with you, slowly, from the beginning. How the most wanted revolutionary on earth ended up starving and alone in the mountains of Bolivia, what was done to him in the day and a half after they caught him, and why, more than half a century later, it has never quite stopped being argued about. Pour something warm. This one runs long. Begin in a place almost no one had heard of, La Higuera, a scatter of mud brick houses on a ridge in the southeast of Bolivia, far from any city, far from any paved road. On the morning of the 9th of October, 1967, the most important building in that village was its schoolhouse, a single room with a dirt floor and a low ceiling, and on the floor of that room sat a man with his hands bound, his clothes in rags, one leg wounded, his beard matted, his breathing shallow and tight. The soldiers guarding him were boys, most of them conscripts from the highlands who had been told for months that they were chasing bandits. They were nervous around him in a way they could not quite explain. Because the man on the floor was not a bandit, he was Ernesto Guevara, the Argentine the whole world called Che. 8 years earlier he had ridden into Havana beside Fidel Castro as one of the victorious commanders of the Cuban Revolution. He had been a minister, a banker, the second most recognizable face of a government that had defied the United States from 90 miles off its coast. He had stood at the podium of the United Nations and lectured the great powers of the world. And now he sat on the floor of a schoolhouse in a village with no electricity, a prisoner of an army that could hardly believe its luck. Try to hold the strangeness of it for a moment, because the soldiers around him could not. For the better part of a year, the entire weight of the Bolivian state, and a good deal of the attention of the most powerful country on earth, had been bent toward finding this one man in a country the size of France and Spain combined. He had been a rumor, then a ghost, then a name whispered up the chain of command and disbelieved. And now here he was, an ordinary-looking man of middle age, bearded and filthy and breathing badly, sitting in the dust of a schoolroom that smelled of chalk and old wood smoke, close enough to touch. Some of the boys guarding him had grown up being told that this man was a kind of devil. None of them had expected the devil to look so tired. Within a few hours he would be dead. That much you may already know. But the death itself, the actual minutes of it, is only the middle of this story. What came before it was a slow, grinding 11-month disaster that pulled in the armies of 2 nations, the intelligence service of a third, and a cast of men whose lives would all bend permanently around the few days they spent near this prisoner. And what came after it, what was done to his body in the week that followed, is the part that earns the word in the title of this film. The part that, once you know it, is genuinely hard to set back down. So we are going to take our time. We are going to understand how a man with that much fame, that much protection, that much of the world watching, ended up cornered in a country he had entered under a false name, with a column of fighters that had dwindled to a handful, betrayed by the very people he had come to liberate. And then we are going to sit with what his captors decided to do, and what they decided the world should be told. To understand the man on that schoolhouse floor, you have to go back, not far, just a few years, to the moment a man at the very summit of a revolution looked around at everything he had won and decided to walk away from all of it. Ernesto Guevara was born in Argentina in 1928, into a middle-class family with left-leaning politics and a house full of books. He was asthmatic from early childhood, and the illness shaped him. It kept him indoors and reading when other boys were outside, and it gave him a lifelong habit of pushing his own failing lungs harder than they wanted to go, as if to prove the body did not get the final say. He trained as a doctor, and then, before he ever really settled into medicine, he did the thing that turned him from a young man into a legend, in his own mind first and the world's much later. He got on a motorcycle and rode the length of South America. What he saw on that journey changed him. The mines where workers were used up and thrown away, the plantations, the sick who could not pay for care. He spent weeks volunteering among the desperately poor, including at a colony of people with leprosy, the most cast-out human beings he could find, and something in him hardened into a conviction he never lost. He stopped believing that the suffering he was looking at was an accident, or a thing that better doctors could fix one patient at a time. He came to believe it was a system, deliberate and defended, and that the system had a name and a center of gravity, and that the center was the economic power of the United States over the whole of Latin America. From that conviction, he never wavered again for the rest of his life. Everything that follows in this story grows out of it. Mexico, in 1955, he met a young Cuban exile named Fidel Castro, who was planning an almost comically hopeless invasion of his own homeland to overthrow its dictator. Guevara signed on as the expedition's doctor. In December of 1956, 82 men crowded onto a leaking yacht built to carry about 20 and sailed for Cuba. The landing was a shambles. Batista's forces found them within days and nearly wiped them out on the beaches and in the cane fields. Fewer than 20 of the 82 survived to reach the cover of the mountains. Among the survivors, climbing into the Sierra Maestra with a handful of rifles and almost nothing else, were Fidel Castro, his brother Raúl, and the asthmatic Argentine doctor. Over the next 2 years, in those mountains, Guevara became something other than a doctor. He became a commander, and a formidable one. His column was known for its iron discipline, its tactical skill, and its relentless political schooling of the peasants who joined it. He was also, already, willing to do the hard and ugly things that guerrilla war demands. He ordered the execution of informers and deserters when he judged it necessary, without apparent hesitation. By the time the war reached its climax, he was Castro's most trusted field commander, and he had learned, in the most practical possible way, that a revolution is held together as much by fear as by faith. Those mountain years are worth pausing on, because they made the man, who would later walk into Bolivia, certain that he knew how this kind of war was won. Life in the Sierra Maestra was hunger and rain and endless marching, ambush and retreat, the slow, patient building of a peasant network that fed the fighters and hid them and carried their messages. Guevara thrived in it in a way that surprised even him. The asthma that had ruled his whole life became simply one more enemy to be marched through. He set up field clinics, then schools to teach his men to read, then a clandestine newspaper, and even a small radio transmitter, building the bones of a tiny shadow state inside the mountains. He was admired by some of his men and feared by most of them, a commander who would give away his last scrap of food and then, the same week, order a deserter or an informer shot without a flicker of hesitation. And by the end he had distilled from those hills a whole theory of revolution. A conviction that a small band of the truly committed, hardened in the countryside and joined by a peasantry with nothing left to lose, could bring down any government on earth. It was a powerful idea. It was also, though he could not see it yet, a lesson learned in conditions that would never quite repeat. He would spend the rest of his life trying to light the same fire twice. The climax came at the very end of 1958, at the city of Santa Clara. Guevara led a column of perhaps 300 guerrillas against a much larger government force, defending one of the largest cities in the country. The decisive stroke came when his fighters tore up a railway line and derailed an armored train the regime had sent full of reinforcements and heavy weapons. The soldiers aboard surrendered, their equipment was captured, and within 3 days the city had fallen. Days later, the dictator fled the country, and the revolution had won. Hold the name Santa Clara somewhere in your mind. It will come back at the very end of this story, in a way you could not possibly guess from here. Now we arrive at the part of the man this film cannot honestly leave out. Because if I told you only the heroic half, I would be doing exactly what so many tellings of his life do, and you would have every right to stop trusting me. When the revolution took power at the start of 1959, Guevara was given command of the old fortress prison of La Cabaña, overlooking Havana, and in those first months he presided over the revolutionary tribunals that tried the police, the soldiers, and the officials of the fallen regime. Many of those men were guilty of real and terrible things. The trials were also swift, the defense was thin, and the sentences were often death. How many men went to the wall under his authority is still argued over. Careful researchers have counted dozens with names attached. Some estimates run into the hundreds. Guevara did not hide from it or apologize for it. He believed the revolution had enemies and that mercy toward them was a betrayal of everyone the old regime had killed. I am telling you this plainly because you cannot understand what people feel about this man in either direction without it. To millions he is a saint of resistance, the doctor who gave up everything for the poor. To millions of others, including many Cubans who lost family in those years, he is the man who signed the orders at La Cabaña, and the shirt with his face on it is an obscenity. This film is not here to settle that argument. It cannot be settled, because both of those men were real, and they were the same man. What this film is about is what was done to him by other people at the end. And as you will see, you do not have to admire him to be unsettled by it. Through the early 1960s, Guevara held real power. He ran the National Bank for a time, then served as Minister of Industries for 4 years, trying to remake the Cuban economy by sheer will. He preached what he called moral incentives over material ones, the idea that the new socialist man should work harder for the love of the revolution rather than for money. And he led by example, spending his weekends cutting sugar cane and hauling sacks alongside the volunteers. He also became the revolution's voice to the world. In December of 1964, he stood before the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York and denounced the great powers to their faces, and a few months later, in Algiers, he gave a speech that quietly detonated his own career. He accused the Soviet Union, Cuba's essential patron, the country whose oil and weapons and money kept the revolution alive, of exploiting the poor nations of the world almost as cynically as the capitalists did. It was true, and it was unforgivable. You do not insult the hand that feeds an island under blockade. When he came home, the most famous revolutionary in Cuba had become, very quietly, an embarrassment. So in 1965 he left. Whether he was eased out or simply could not bear to stay, the result was the same. He wrote a farewell letter to Castro renouncing his rank, his official positions, and even his Cuban citizenship, freeing Cuba of any blame for whatever he did next. He vanished from public view so completely that rumors flew for months that Castro had killed him. That October, Castro read the farewell letter aloud to the Cuban people, and the world understood that Guevara had gone to make revolution somewhere else, where no one outside a tiny circle knew. The answer, at first, was Africa. He took a small group of Cuban fighters into the Congo to support a rebel movement there. It was a disaster from almost the first week. The local fighters he had come to train did not share his discipline or his urgency. The political situation was a tangle he never mastered, and his own lungs failed him in the climate. After roughly 7 months, he pulled the survivors out, in secret, having achieved nothing. He called it, in his own writing, a failure. He was 37 years old. He had given up his home and his name and his place in history, and his great continental revolution had collapsed in a foreign forest before it had truly begun. A lesser man, or a wiser one, might have stopped there. Guevara did the opposite. He went looking for the next mountain, and the place he chose, after months of secret planning, was a poor and landlocked country in the heart of South America, a country he believed could become the spark that set the whole continent alight. He chose Bolivia. It would be the last choice he ever made as a free man, and almost every assumption he carried into it was wrong. In November of 1966, a balding, clean-shaven, slightly stout businessman in heavy glasses arrived in Bolivia. His passport, issued by Uruguay, identified him as Adolfo Mena Gonzalez, a representative of an international economic organization, there to study the country's conditions. He photographed well. He looked like a tired executive. He looked like nothing at all. It was Guevara. The disguise was so complete that even some of the Cuban fighters who later joined him in the field did not at first recognize the man they had crossed the world to follow. He had shaved the famous beard, plucked his hairline back, and dressed himself as the very kind of man he had spent his life fighting. And under that costume he made his way to a remote farm in the southeast of the country, in a dry, broken landscape of canyons and thorn scrub along a river called the Nyancahuazu. There, the army of the world revolution would be born. There was, at that point, no army. There was a farmhouse, a few crates of weapons, and a slowly gathering band of men. That band was the heart of the whole gamble, and it is worth knowing who they were. The core were Cubans, hand-picked veterans, men who had fought beside Guevara in the Sierra Maestra and trusted him with their lives. To them he added Bolivian volunteers, some of them communists, and a few fighters from other countries, including Peru. They took the name the National Liberation Army of Bolivia. At its peak, the whole force numbered only around 50 men to ignite a continent. Guevara did not think that number absurd, because he had a theory, and the theory told him the number did not matter very much at the start. The theory was one he had helped make famous. It said that a small band of dedicated guerrillas, simply by striking at the army and surviving, could become a spark. Their very existence would prove to the oppressed peasants that the state could be fought. The peasants would shelter them. then feed them, then join them, and the small band would swell into a peasant army, and the peasant army would topple the government. It had worked in Cuba, more or less, or at least that was the story everyone now told about Cuba. Guevara believed it could be done again, deliberately, anywhere the misery was deep enough, like following a recipe. Bolivia would be the kitchen. Almost every ingredient was missing. Start with the land itself. The southeast where he set up his base was not full of the oppressed and ready peasants the theory required. It was thinly populated, and the few farmers who lived there spoke Quechua or Guarani, not the Spanish of the Cuban and Argentine fighters. To these farmers, the bearded strangers with guns were not liberators. They were outsiders, frightening and unwelcome, and many of them did exactly what frightened farmers do. They went to the army the first chance they got, and told the soldiers what they had seen. The peasant base the entire campaign depended on never appeared. It was not slow to come. It simply was not there, and it never would be. It is worth seeing the country itself, because the country was an enemy too. This was not the green jungle most people picture when they imagine guerrillas. The zone around the Nyancahuazu was a maze of steep, dry canyons and thorn bush, savage with heat by day and cold at night, with little reliable water and almost nothing to forage. The maps were bad. The few trails were known only to locals who would not guide them. The Cuban veterans, who had won their war in the green wooded mountains of a tropical island, found themselves in a landscape that drained the body, offered no cover, and gave no food. Men grew sick, feet rotted in wet boots and split open. The simple daily business of staying alive and fed began to swallow the energy that was supposed to go into making a revolution. Guevara's diary through these months becomes a quiet ledger of the body's defeats. Swollen feet, failed hunts, the asthma closing his chest in the thin cold air until he could not stand. A stream marked on the map that turned out to be dry. The romance of the guerrilla is nowhere in those pages. There is only the country and the weight of the packs and the next ridge and the one after that. Then there was the matter of the Bolivian communists, the very people Guevara most needed as allies. The leader of the Bolivian Communist Party, a man named Mario Monge, came out to the camp to meet him. Monge was willing to help, but he wanted a price. He wanted political and military command of any guerrilla movement on Bolivian soil to be in Bolivian hands, his hands. Guevara refused. He had not crossed the world and shed his own name to take orders from a local party official, and in his mind the revolution was continental, not national. So the question of which country's man led it was almost beside the point. The two could not agree. Monge left the camp, and with him went the organized support of the only political network in the country that might have fed the guerrillas recruits, supplies, and safe houses. Before the first shot of the campaign was ever fired, Guevara had lost the local alliance he could least afford to lose. With Monge gone, the isolation became almost total. There would be no steady flow of recruits from the cities to replace the men who fell, no safe houses to fall back into, no friendly newspaper, no political wing translating the gunfire into a movement, none of the patient underground organizing that had quietly held up the Cuban War and that the legend of Cuba always left out of the story. Guevara had come to believe, partly from his own famous writings, that the armed band itself was the engine of everything, that the fighting would generate the politics, that you did not need to build the movement first, because the movement would assemble itself around the sound of the guns. Bolivia was about to test that belief to destruction. The band would fight and fight well, and the politics would simply never come. For now, though, in the first warm weeks of the year, none of that was visible. There were still supplies in the caches and rounds in the crates and a kind of grim confidence in the camp. The disaster was already set. It simply had not begun. There was also, far away in the cities, a thin urban network keeping the whole thing supplied with information and contacts. Its most important agent was a woman the guerrillas knew as Tania, who had spent years building a false life inside Bolivian society for exactly this moment. Remember her. Her story becomes one of the most painful threads in all of this, and it ends at a river. Now, picture what Guevara actually held. In the early weeks of 1967, around 50 fighters, a base in a harsh stretch of country whose people did not want him. No real supply line, no urban movement of any size, no peasant recruits, and a theory that assumed every one of those problems would solve itself once the shooting started. He was not wrong that the shooting would start. He was wrong about everything that would happen after. For a few months, it almost looked like a real campaign. The men trained, scouted the canyons, cached supplies, and learned the brutal country. Guevara, whose asthma made every march a private ordeal, drove himself and them without mercy. There were quarrels, shortages, the ordinary misery of armed men living rough. But the secret held. The Bolivian army did not yet know that the most wanted revolutionary in the hemisphere was camped in its own backyard. For a little while longer, the band by the Yankahuazu was a problem that did not officially exist. That ended on a single day in March, with an ambush Guevara did not even plan, and that announced his presence to the world long before he was ready for it. On the 23rd of March, 1967, a Bolivian army patrol moved up the canyon of the Yankahuazu, following reports that something was wrong out there. The guerrillas saw them coming and set a hasty ambush along the river. When the soldiers walked into it, the guerrillas opened fire. The fight was short and lopsided. Several soldiers were killed, several more were captured, and the rest fled. The guerrillas took weapons, ammunition, and prisoners, and lost no one. As a piece of soldiering, it was a clean success. As a piece of strategy, it was a catastrophe, and Guevara seems to have understood that almost at once, because the ambush did the one thing he was not ready for. It told the Bolivian government, and behind it the United States, exactly where he was. The band that had been a rumor was now a bleeding fact, written in dead soldiers, and from that day the full weight of the state began to turn toward the southeast. The guerrillas had wanted to choose the moment they revealed themselves. The moment chose them instead. For a few weeks, the early fighting only seemed to prove the theory right. The guerrillas were good, far better than the green conscripts sent against them, and they handed the army a series of stinging defeats. The worst came in the middle of April, near a place called Erasure, where Guevara's men sprang 2 ambushes on the same day. By the end of it, they had killed around 8 soldiers, wounded a similar number, and taken some 28 prisoners, whom they lectured and then released. To a guerrilla counting only the day's results, it looked like a victory. To a strategist, every one of those victories was a slow poison. Each ambush brought more soldiers into the region, drew more American attention, and tightened the noose by another turn. The guerrillas were winning battles and losing the war with every shot they fired, and the better they fought, the faster they lost it. You can watch the trap close in the pages of the diary, even as its author refuses to call it a trap. Month by month, the entries grow grimmer, the food shorter, the men sicker, the marches longer and more aimless, looping back through the same hard country in search of an exit that was not there. A small radio let them hear the government's version of their own story, the announcements of their imminent destruction, the names of dead comrades read out over the air as slain bandits. They learned to move at night and lie up in the heat of the day, to ration the little they had, to treat their wounds with whatever a doctor could improvise from a nearly empty bag. And all the while, the soldiers chasing them were getting better. The frightened conscripts of the spring, the ones who had stumbled into ambushes and died, were being replaced by men who had been trained to hunt, who set their own ambushes now, who did not break and run. The balance was tilting slowly at first, and then not so slowly. The guerrillas could still win almost any single firefight. What they could no longer do was the thing a guerrilla force must always be able to do, which is to break contact, vanish into the population, and recover. The country was too bare, the army too many, the people too unwilling to hide them. Every clash cost them men they had no way to replace, and bought them only a few more days of marching toward the next one. There were bolder strokes, too. In July, growing short of medicine and supplies, the guerrillas marched out of the wilderness and seized a small town called Samayapata on a main highway, holding it briefly and taking what they needed before melting back into the hills. It embarrassed the government badly. The most wanted man in the hemisphere had just walked into a Bolivian town in broad daylight, but it also confirmed, to anyone still doubting, that this was no minor bandit problem, and it brought the hammer down harder. Then came a blow that was almost stranger than the ambushes. In the chaos of the early weeks, 2 visitors who had come to the guerrilla zone to meet the great Guevara found themselves trapped by the tightening army cordon and unable to get out. One was a young French writer and intellectual named Régis Debray, a man who had built much of his fame on Guevara's own theory of guerrilla war. The other was an Argentine. In April, they tried to slip away from the zone and were captured by the army near a town called Muyapampa in civilian clothes, with no convincing explanation for what they were doing there. Their capture was a gift to the men hunting Guevara. Under interrogation, the army learned what it had only suspected, that the guerrillas in the canyons were not local bandits or a stray communist cell, but an international column, Cuban-led, and that the man at its head was very likely Che Guevara himself. The news climbed the chain of command to the Bolivian High Command and to the Americans, and it electrified them. The most dangerous revolutionary in the Western Hemisphere, the man who had helped take Cuba and then vanished from the earth, was here, in the open, in a poor country whose army the United States already trained and funded. He was no longer a ghost, he was a target, and a target can be hunted to the ground.
There was a detail in that interrogation that did real and lasting damage. One of the 2 captured men, the Argentine, was an artist.
And under questioning, he did something small that haunts the story. He drew them. Sitting with his interrogators, he sketched the faces of the guerrillas he had seen in the camp, careful likenesses of men who until that moment had been only code names and rumors. Those drawings were copied and passed out to the units in the field, so that a soldier at a checkpoint or lying in an ambush would now know the face of the man in front of him. It is a tiny thing, a handful of pencil portraits, and it tightened the net by another notch. As for the Frenchman Debray, he became a cause in his own right. His arrest drew the attention of intellectuals and governments across the world, and in time he was put on trial and sentenced to 30 years in a Bolivian prison, though in the end he would serve only a small fraction of it. For Guevara, hiding and marching in the hills The lesson of the whole affair was bitter and simple. The outside world now knew, beyond any doubt, that he was in Bolivia. The secret that might have bought him time was gone for good. From here on, everyone who mattered was looking in the right country, at the right mountains, for the right man. Through all of it, Guevara kept a diary. Almost every day, in a small, steady hand, he recorded the marches, the arguments, the shrinking stocks of food, his own worsening health, the men who fell. It is one of the most remarkable documents of its kind, because it is the private ledger of a man watching his grand design come apart while refusing, page after page, to write the word defeat. The diary matters to our story for two reasons. First, because it is why we know these final months in such intimate detail, and second, because of where the diary would end up, and in whose hands, on the very last morning. We will get to that. There was one more disaster baked into those early weeks, and it was structural, and it was permanent. Back in the spring, Guevara had taken part of his column on a long march to scout the country and harden the men, leaving the rest behind as a rear guard. The plan was to reunite within days, but the country was vast and trackless. The army was now moving through it, and the two halves of the little force could not find each other again. Days became weeks. Weeks became forever. From that point on, Guevara's already tiny army was split into two pieces that would never join hands again. Each would be hunted down separately, and the rear guard, lost somewhere in the wilderness with a woman called Tania among them, was marching, though none of them knew it, straight toward a river and an ambush. The rear guard was led by a veteran Cuban fighter who went by the name Joaquin. With him were the men cut off from Guevara back in the spring, and among them was the one woman in the entire guerrilla effort. Her name was Tamara Bunke, though everyone called her Tania. She had been born in Argentina to German parents who had fled fascism in Europe, raised partly in East Germany, fluent in several languages, and fiercely committed to the revolutionary cause. For years she had been Guevara's most important agent inside Bolivia. She had built a false identity, moved in the right social circles in the capital, befriended officials, gathered information, and laid the quiet groundwork for the very campaign that was now coming apart. She was, by every account, brave and capable and completely devoted. And by the summer of 1967 she was trapped, with Joaquin's lost rear guard, sick and exhausted, marching in circles through the wilderness with a shrinking group of doomed men, searching for a commander who could not be found. To understand how badly her ending betrays her life, you have to know what that life had been. For years before the first shot was fired, Tania had lived a lie of extraordinary discipline inside Bolivia. She had built a false identity, an ordinary woman with an ordinary past, and worked her way into the social world of the capital, befriending officials, even people close to the government, gathering scraps of useful information and quietly preparing the ground for the rising that was supposed to come. It is exhausting, corrosive work to be someone else for years on end, to never quite sleep, to weigh every word before you say it. By every account she did it without visibly cracking. And then, in the chaos of the split that spring, she had ended up on the wrong side of it, caught with the rear guard. Instead of safe behind her city cover, her years of secret value gone the instant she picked up a rifle and marched. From the most patient kind of underground work, she had been thrown into the most desperate kind of open one. The woman who had spent years staying perfectly hidden would spend her last months unable to hide at all, wandering a wilderness with a dwindling column of sick men, hunted and hungry and lost. The rear guard's final weeks were a slow torment of false hopes and wrong turns, of fording rivers and doubling back, always a day late and a valley off. Looking for a commander the army had already cut them away from for good. The end came for them at the end of August, at a place called Vado del Yeso, a ford across a river called the Rio Grande. The group, starving, had stopped at the hut of a local farmer to buy food. They trusted him. It was the kind of small, ordinary transaction the whole guerrilla effort depended on, and it killed them. The farmer went to the army and told the soldiers where the guerrillas were and which way they would cross the river. The army laid an ambush at the ford and waited. On the morning of the 31st of August, 1967, Joaquin's group came down to the crossing. They went into the water, and the soldiers, hidden on the far bank, opened fire into them as they waited, exposed, in the open river with nowhere to take cover. It was not a battle, it was a killing. Almost the entire rear guard died there, in the water. Tania was among them. By the accounts that came later, she was hit as she crossed and went down without ever firing her weapon. Her body carried off downstream and not recovered for days. She was 30 years old. Shankomo. The rear guard that died at the ford was made up of men who had marched and starved for months on the strength of a single promise, that they would find their commander again and rejoin the fight. Some had been with Guevara since Cuba. Others were young Bolivians who had believed, against all the evidence, that their country was about to rise. They had spent their last weeks lost, sick, quarreling, burying their own dead, growing thinner, and then they died in a few minutes in a river they were only trying to cross. There is a particular cruelty in the timing of it. For months, the two halves of the same small army had been wandering the same wilderness, each searching for the other, sometimes passing within a few valleys and never meeting, while the net drew shut around them both. Guevara needed the rear guard. The rear guard was dying to reach him, and the country was so vast and so set against them that they went into their graves without ever closing the gap. When Guevara finally understood that they were gone, something in the campaign went quiet. He had lost not only half of his fighters, but the last version of his plan in which all the pieces still fit together. With the destruction of Joaquin's group at the river, Guevara's force was cut roughly in half a second time, and this time it was fatal. He did not even know for certain for a while that they were gone. He only knew the rear guard had vanished and would not be coming. Roughly half of his already tiny army had been wiped out in a single morning at a river crossing, betrayed by a farmer they had paid for a meal, and the manner of it, the betrayal by the very peasants the entire theory had promised would rise up and join him, was the theory itself dying in front of his eyes. The people he had come to liberate were turning him in for the reward, or out of simple fear, or because to them he was just a dangerous stranger in their valley. It hardly mattered which. The effect was the same. I find I have to sit with that for a moment whenever I reach it, because it is the quiet hinge of the whole tragedy, and it has nothing to do with armies or intelligence services. Guevara's entire plan, the theory he had carried out of the Sierra Maestra and across the world, rested on a single assumption about ordinary people, that the poor, once shown that the powerful could be fought, would rise. Everything was staked on it. And in Bolivia, the ordinary people looked at the bearded strangers in their hills and made a different choice, again and again. They did not see liberators. They saw trouble, armed and foreign, the kind of trouble that gets a family killed. So they fed the soldiers instead, and pointed, and went back to their fields. There is no villain in that. There is only the gap between a beautiful idea about human beings and the frightened, practical reality of them. And it was in that gap that the whole campaign quietly bled to death. Guevara would keep marching for 5 more weeks after the river. But the river is where the dream ended. Everything after it was just a strong will refusing to admit the dream was already gone. What was left to Guevara now was a column of fewer than 20, hungry, ragged, and ill, in country that hated them, with an enemy growing stronger by the week. He kept marching, he kept writing in the diary. He kept looking, against all the evidence in front of him, for the turn that would prove the theory right. But the men around him were starting to understand something he would not say. They were not the spark of a continental revolution anymore. They were a hunted remnant, and the country had become a trap, closing canyon by canyon around them. And while it closed, a different kind of force was arriving in Bolivia. Not ragged and starving, but fresh, trained, well-fed, and paid for in dollars. The hunters were about to get very, very good at their work, because the most powerful country on earth had decided that this small, failing band of sick men in the mountains was worth its full and undivided attention. To the United States in 1967, the news that Che Guevara was leading a guerrilla insurgency in Bolivia was not a small matter. It was, in the language of the Cold War, exactly the nightmare they had spent a decade trying to prevent. The fear was not really about Bolivia. The fear was that Guevara would do across South America what he had helped do in Cuba, that one success would become two, that the continent would begin to come apart in the very cascade of revolutions he openly said he wanted. The man had announced, in print, his intention to create 2, 3, many Vietnams, to bleed the great powers in a dozen jungles at once until the whole structure collapsed. The United States was already bleeding in the first Vietnam. It had every intention of strangling the second in its cradle. So Washington moved in 2 ways, quietly and effectively. The first was soldiers. In the spring of 1967, a small team of United States Army Special Forces, the Green Berets, arrived in Bolivia from their base in the Panama Canal Zone. The team numbered around 16 men, and it was led by a tough, experienced major named Ralph Shelton, known to everyone as Pappy. Their job was not to fight Guevara themselves. Their job was to take the raw material of the Bolivian army, poorly trained highland conscripts, and turn it into something that could actually corner and beat a guerrilla force in the field. They set up at an old, half-abandoned sugar mill at a place called La Esperanza, north of the city of Santa Cruz, and there, over roughly 19 weeks, they built a unit from nothing. It was called the 2nd Ranger Battalion. The Americans trained them hard, in marksmanship, in patrolling, in the specific, brutal craft of hunting men through rough terrain. By the end of the program, the Bolivians, who had been farm boys and street recruits a few months earlier, were, in the judgment of the men who trained them, the best soldiers in the entire Bolivian army. And then they were sent south, into the zone where Guevara's starving remnant was still marching, with orders to find him. Behind them, in support, the army was massing enormous numbers. By October, something like 1,800 soldiers were operating against a guerrilla band that had shrunk to fewer than 20. Sit with that ratio for a second, because it tells you the contest was already over as a military matter. Roughly 100 soldiers for every starving guerrilla, fresh battalions against sick men, an air force overhead, a road network and radios, and an endless supply of food and ammunition against a column that was running short of all 4. The guerrillas were no longer hunting anything. They were the hunted, and the hunt had become a vast, patient, methodical operation. The rangers worked the canyons in sweeps, aircraft watched from above, and most decisive of all, the army had finally learned to use the one weapon the guerrillas could never match, which was the local people. Soldiers paid for information, or simply asked for it, and the farmers who would never shelter a guerrilla were perfectly willing to tell a passing patrol which way the strangers had gone, and when and how many there were. Every meal the guerrillas begged or bought from a peasant hut became a report filed with the nearest garrison. The net was not really made of soldiers at all. It was made of 1,000 small betrayals by people who only wanted the danger gone from their valley. And it was drawn tighter every single day by men who now had all the time in the world because they knew the thing they were hunting could not feed itself, could not heal, and could not get out. The second thing Washington sent was quieter, and in the end it mattered even more. The Central Intelligence Agency sent its own men, and the ones it chose were not ordinary case officers. They were Cuban exiles, men who had their own bitter history with Guevara and the revolution he had built, men who had in some cases fought against that revolution at the Bay of Pigs and lost. The most important of them, for our story, was a young operative named Felix Rodriguez. A second Cuban exile working for the agency, Gustavo Vilodo, was in the field as well. Rodriguez was Cuban-born, fiercely anti-communist, and personally invested in this hunt in a way no salaried American officer could be. To him, Guevara was not an abstract Cold War problem. He was the enemy, the embodiment of everything that had taken his country from him. He embedded himself with the Bolivian forces in the field, advising, organizing intelligence, sharpening the hunt, posing as a Bolivian officer. He was, in a sense, the living link between the ragged soldiers in the canyons and the great machinery of American power standing behind them, and he would be the last man of any real consequence to speak with Che Guevara while Guevara was still alive. Hold that name, Felix Rodriguez. He walks back into this story at the very end, on a helicopter, wearing a dead man's watch. Men like Rodriguez did more than advise on tactics. They were building a picture, gathering every scrap, debriefing prisoners and deserters, reading captured documents, piecing together from 100 fragments where the column had been and where it might go next. For the Cuban exiles among them, this was not a job, it was a reckoning. They had lost their country to the revolution this man embodied, lost homes and families and a whole world, and now they had been handed the chance to be there at the end of its most famous figure. It is hard to overstate how much that personal hunger sharpened the hunt. A salaried officer goes home when his posting ends. These men had been waiting years for this one, and above all of them, far away in Washington, the importance of the thing kept climbing. The reports went up the chain to the highest levels of the United States government, because the prospect of a second Cuba, lit by the very man who had helped to light the first, was taken with deadly seriousness. The full attention of a superpower had quietly come to rest on 17 starving men in a stretch of Bolivian canyon. They never really stood a chance. A quick word here, and then I will stay out of the story until it is finished. If you have come this far into the night with me, there is a fair chance you will want the next one of these when it comes. Following Greymark History Hour is simply how it reaches you, without you ever having to go looking for it. That is the only time I will ask you for anything. Now, back to the mountains, because the net is almost shut. By the autumn of 1967, everything was converging on the same small patch of ground. Guevara's column was down to a tiny number, 17 men, sick and half-starved, some of them so weak that Guevara, who could barely breathe himself, sometimes had to ride a mule because he could no longer walk. The newly trained rangers were sweeping the region in strength, guided by a steady trickle of information from the local farmers, who knew the country and wanted these dangerous strangers gone. The CIA was reading the signs and tightening the noose. The most famous revolutionary alive was now a hunted animal in a closing pen, and in the last pages of his diary, you can feel that he knew it, even as he refused, to the end, to write the word. The pen closed at a narrow, dry ravine called the Quebrada del Churro on the 8th of October. In the first days of October 1967, Guevara's 17 survivors were moving through the canyons near the village of La Higuera, trying to slip the tightening cordon and reach better country. They did not know that the army already had a rough idea of where they were. As so often in this campaign, the information had come from a local. A farmer in the area had spotted the guerrillas, or the signs of them, and carried word to the rangers. The soldiers moved to seal the ground. By now the column was a shadow of an army. 17 men, most of them ill, all of them hungry, their boots coming apart, their commander so weakened by asthma and exhaustion that on the worst days he could barely keep his feet under him. They had been marching and fighting and starving for the better part of a year, and the country had ground them down to almost nothing. They knew, in the practical way that exhausted men know things, that they had to break out of this maze of canyons and reach somewhere they could rest and resupply, or it would end here. What they did not know was that the army had read the same map and drawn the same conclusion, and had already moved to close the gaps. The guerrillas were searching for a way out of a box whose lid had quietly come down above them. In the last days, more than one local resident, seeing armed strangers near their land, did what so many had done before, and carried word toward the soldiers. The rangers moved into their positions in the dark and waited, and in the early hours, the guerrillas, looking for cover and water, made their way down into exactly the wrong ground. On the morning of the 8th of October, the guerrillas descended into a narrow ravine, the Quebrada del Churro, a dry cleft in the mountains with steep walls. It was a trap, though they did not yet know it. The rangers, the men Pappy Shelton's team had trained, had taken positions on the high ground all around it. The unit closing the ring was a company commanded by a young, capable Bolivian captain named Gary Prado. When the guerrillas were well down into the ravine, the soldiers opened fire from above. The fight that followed was desperate and confused, the close, scrambling kind of action that happens when trapped men try to claw their way out of a killing ground. The guerrillas were outnumbered, outpositioned, and exhausted past the edge of endurance. Some were killed in the first exchanges. Others tried to break out in small groups for the high ground or the cover of the ravine walls. And here the story splits in two, because some of them made it. A handful of fighters fought clear of the ravine that day and slipped through the cordon, and a small number of them, after weeks of flight, would eventually escape Bolivia altogether and reach safety in Chile. Men with guerrilla names like Pombo, Benigno, Urbano, and the Bolivian called Inti. It is largely thanks to those few survivors that we have the story from the inside at all, but their commander was not among them. It is worth slowing down on those few who got away, because they are the reason this last day is not simply a blank space filled in by the army. Fighting their way clear of the ravine and through the cordon, a small group of survivors began a flight that would last for weeks, moving by night through the same merciless country, slipping past patrols, half-starved, with a price on every head. Against the odds, some of them lived. A handful eventually crossed out of Bolivia altogether and reached safety in Chile, and from there, the world. They carried out with them the inside story of the campaign. The names, the marches, the arguments, the exact way it had all come apart, and in time several of them wrote it down. So when we speak of what happened in and after that ravine, we are not only repeating the official account of the victors. We have, woven through it, the testimony of men who had stood beside Guevara that very morning and lived to tell it. Their memories, alongside his own captured diary, are why the schoolhouse is not a sealed room to us. They are the reason we can stand, in a sense, in the doorway. And what they describe, once the shooting in the ravine had stopped, is the strangest and most human stretch of the entire story. A wounded, world-famous prisoner and a room full of frightened men who did not yet know what they were allowed to do with him. In the middle of the fight, Guevara was hit. A round struck him in the lower leg. Another, by most accounts, smashed into his rifle and put it out of action, leaving him wounded and effectively disarmed at the bottom of a ravine swept by fire. He did not die there, and that simple fact is the hinge on which this entire story turns. Wounded, unable to fight, he was helped by one of his men, a Bolivian fighter the others, called Willie, whose full name was Simon Cuba. Willie tried to get the wounded Guevara up and out of the ravine, half carrying him toward the high ground. They did not make it. Soldiers closed in on the two struggling men, and there, cornered, with no weapon that worked and no strength left to run, the most wanted guerrilla in the world was taken alive. There is a line that has come down to us from that moment, reported by the soldiers who were there. As they closed in, Guevara is said to have called out for them to stop shooting, identifying himself, telling them in effect, "Do not shoot, I am Che. I am worth more to you alive than dead." Whether those were the exact words, no recording exists to prove, but the substance of it rings true, because it was simply a fact. Captured alive, Che Guevara was the most valuable prisoner in the hemisphere. A living Guevara could be interrogated, tried, displayed, traded. A living Guevara was worth more than almost anything. He was betting his life on that arithmetic. For a few hours it even seemed as if he might be right. The soldiers could hardly believe what they had. Word went up the chain of command at once, by radio, climbing from the captain in the ravine to the regional command, to the high command in the capital, and across to the Americans. They have Guevara, he is alive. He is wounded, but he is alive. And then they did the practical thing. They took their prisoner, along with the other captured and dead guerrillas, and moved them the short, hard distance to the nearest shelter, the only building that would serve, the schoolhouse at La Higuera, the one room with the dirt floor. They laid the dead in one part of it and put the living prisoners in another, set their nervous boy soldiers to guard the man on the floor, and waited for the world to tell them what to do with him. The decision about what to do with Che Guevara would be made that night and the following morning, in radio messages passing between a mud village and a presidential palace, with an American listening in. And it is in those hours, between the capture and the killing, that you can see most clearly the thing this film is really about. Not a death in battle, a choice. The night of the 8th of October into the 9th was the longest of Che Guevara's life, and the last. He spent it on the floor of the schoolhouse, his hands bound, his wounded leg untreated beyond the crudest care, in a room he shared with the bodies of men who had followed him to this place and died for it that afternoon. Nearby were the few comrades taken alive with him, including Willie, the man who had tried to carry him out, and another captured fighter, a revolutionary from Peru known as El Chino. Through the night, Bolivian officers came to look at him and to question him. The accounts of those hours come mostly from his captors, so we should hold them a little loosely, but a consistent picture emerges. Guevara was in pain and exhausted, but composed. He answered some questions and refused others. He would not give information that might harm the men still at large. When officers tried to bait or insult him, he met it with a flat, contemptuous calm that seems to have unnerved them more than any defiance could have. He was their prisoner, helpless on the floor, and yet several of the men who came to gloat left the room shaken, as if the moral weight of it had quietly shifted under them in the dark. The village outside the floor, schoolhouse, barely understood what had landed in it. La Higuera was a handful of families, a place the modern world had mostly forgotten, and now it was full of soldiers and officers and a crackling radio, and in the schoolroom lay the most famous prisoner in the hemisphere, with the bodies of his dead comrades in the next room. Word ran through the little community in whispers. People came to the door to look and were turned away, or not. Through the long hours, Guevara asked for very little. He was offered food, a bowl of the local soup, and a cigarette, which he smoked. He spoke quietly with some of the soldiers, the ordinary conscripts, and several of them would remember it for the rest of their lives. The strangeness of guarding and talking with a man their own officers so plainly feared, a man who treated them not as enemies but almost as students. He asked after the other prisoners. He did not beg, and he did not rage. He seems to have understood his situation with a terrible clarity, and to have decided to meet it on the only terms still left to him, which were his own. Outside, the radio kept crackling, and far away in the capital, men in a palace were deciding the hour of his death. One small human moment from that night has lasted. A young schoolteacher from the village, a woman in her early 20s named Julia Cortez, came to the schoolhouse, drawn by the impossible news that the famous Che Guevara was lying in her schoolroom. She spoke with him briefly. Years later, she would describe the encounter the way nearly everyone who met him in those final hours did, fixing on his eyes, on a strange gentleness in him, on the sense of a man entirely without fear in a situation that should have been drowning in it. It is a tiny scene. A village teacher and a doomed prisoner exchanging a few quiet words in a room with a dirt floor. But it is part of why this story has never gone cold. The people who were sent to despise him kept coming away, haunted instead. While the prisoner waited, the real decision was being made far above his head, and here the cold machinery shows itself. Two different powers had two different wishes for Che Guevara, and they did not agree. The Americans, through Felix Rodriguez and the chain above him, wanted Guevara kept alive. A living Guevara was an intelligence treasure and a propaganda prize, and the CIA wanted him taken out of the country, to a base, to a long interrogation, to use. The Bolivian government and its president René Barrientos wanted the opposite. To them, a living Guevara was a permanent danger. A trial would become a global stage for him. A prison would become a target for rescue or a rallying cry. A living Che, anywhere on Earth, was a problem that never closed. A dead Che was a problem solved in an afternoon. Look closely at that logic, because it is the cold heart of the whole thing. The men in the palace were not really afraid of Guevara the guerrilla anymore. That Guevara was finished, a wounded prisoner in a schoolroom. His army dead or scattered to the wind. They were afraid of Guevara, the symbol, and they understood, correctly, that the symbol was far more dangerous than the man had ever been. A trial would hand him a stage and a microphone and months of headlines, and he was, whatever else he was, one of the great speakers of his age. A prison sentence would leave him alive somewhere, a magnet for every sympathizer and every rescue scheme on the continent, a wound that never closed. Even handing him to the Americans carried a risk that one day, somehow, he would surface again, talking. There was, to the men weighing it, exactly one way to make the symbol stop being dangerous, and it was to make sure there was no living Guevara anywhere for it to gather around. The decision, in other words, was not a military one. It was barely even about the man on the floor. It was about what he would become, and the only sure way to control that was to end him quickly, quietly, and deniably, in a village too small to matter, before the world's cameras could ever arrive. So that is what they ordered. The order came down by radio from the high command in the capital, in the small hours or the early morning. The men in the field had worked out a simple code for their messages about the prisoner. In that code, the number 500 stood for Guevara himself. The number 600 meant dead. The number 700 meant alive. The message that came over the radio to La Higuera, by the account of the CIA man who was there, was 500 and 600. Guevara, dead. Kill him. Oh, there was one more decision folded into that order, and it tells you everything about what kind of act this was. The government did not intend to admit that it had executed a prisoner. The official story, prepared in advance, would be that Che Guevara had died of wounds received in combat, hours after the battle in the ravine. For that lie to hold, the killing could not look like an execution. The soldier who did it would be told to fire into the body, into the arms and the legs and the chest, and to avoid the head, so that the wounds could be passed off as the marks of a firefight rather than the work of a man standing over a bound prisoner. The death was being staged before it had even happened. Felix Rodriguez arrived at the schoolhouse that morning, having learned the decision. By his own account, he went in to see Guevara and told him simply that he had tried to keep him alive and had failed, that the order was beyond his power to change. Comandante, he is said to have told him, "I am sorry." Before the end, he had Guevara's diary and documents brought out, and he photographed them page by page in the morning light, capturing the private record of the whole doomed campaign for his agency. And at some point in those final minutes, he took, from the prisoner or from the body, Guevara's watch, a steel Rolex, which he would wear and speak about for the rest of his long life. Then the Americans and the officers stepped back, because the actual killing was to be Bolivian work, and the order was passed to a sergeant. The man chosen to do it was a young sergeant named Mario Turan. By the accounts that survive, the soldiers had drawn lots, or been assigned, and the duty fell to him, and he did not want it. He was, the witnesses said, shaking. Some accounts say he had been drinking, to steady himself for a thing no amount of drink can steady a person for. He had his orders, including the cold technical instruction about where to aim so that the body would tell the official lie. And a little after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, on the 9th of October, 1967, he walked into the schoolroom where Che Guevara was waiting. I am going to tell this part plainly and then move on, because there is nothing to be gained by lingering over it, and a great deal of dignity to be lost. Guevara understood what was coming. He had understood it since the radio message. There is a line attributed to him in those last seconds, spoken to the trembling sergeant, And like the line in the ravine, it cannot be perfectly verified, but it has come down through the men who were there, and it fits everything else we know of him. Seeing the soldier hesitate in the doorway, Guevara is said to have told him to stop trembling and take aim, and then to have said, "Shoot, coward, you are only going to kill a man." Tehran fired. He fired a burst into the seated, bound prisoner, into the chest and the limbs, following the order to keep the wounds below the neck. When it was counted afterward, the body carried 9 wounds. Che Guevara was 39 years old. The most famous revolutionary in the world had been executed on the floor of a village schoolhouse by a frightened sergeant on a coded order from a president, in a killing carefully arranged so that it could be denied. He was not the only one to die in La Higuera in those hours. Willie, the man who had tried to carry his wounded commander out of the ravine, was executed too. So was El Chino, the captured fighter who had shared the long night. They were prisoners, disarmed, in custody, and they were shot, and the same lie was prepared to cover their deaths as well. This was not the chaos of battle. The battle had ended the day before. This was an afternoon of administrative killing in a quiet village, the tidying up of a problem. There is a particular horror in that ordinariness, and it is worth naming before we move on. We are conditioned to imagine the deaths of famous men as dramatic, lit, momentous. This was the opposite of all that. It was a procedure, a coded number on a radio, an assigned soldier, an instruction about where to aim, a lie written in advance to cover the wounds. The most extraordinary prisoner in the world was killed in the most bureaucratic way imaginable, on a dirt floor, by frightened men carrying out orders that had been handed to them from somewhere safely far away. No single person in that schoolhouse had to feel that he had made the decision. That was the whole design of it. Everyone was simply following a number that had come over the radio. When it was done, the officers had Guevara's body prepared for the next stage of the plan, because killing him was only the first half of what had to be done. He was, even dead, the most famous man any of them would ever touch, and his corpse was now both their proof and their problem. They had to show the world that the great Che Guevara was truly dead, that the legend was finished, that the threat was over. And so they did something that seems at first to contradict the secrecy of the killing. They put his body on public display. They flew it out of the mountains to be seen. It was the single greatest mistake they could have made, because the image they created in order to prove that Che Guevara was finished is the precise image that made him immortal. They were about to take his photograph, and that photograph would outlive every man in that schoolhouse, and the government that ordered the killing, and the empire that paid for it. The body was loaded, by some accounts, onto the landing skid of a helicopter, lashed to the outside of the aircraft for the short flight out of the mountains, and flown to the nearest town of any size, a place called Valle Grande. There, on the 10th of October, 1967, it was brought to the local hospital, the Nuestra Señora de Malta, and laid out, not in a morgue, but in an open-sided laundry house behind the hospital, on a concrete trough where the washing was usually done. And then, in effect, the doors were opened to the world. The army wanted witnesses. They brought in journalists. They allowed the townspeople to file past. They wanted the photographs taken and the story spread, because the entire point was to kill the myth along with the man, to make it undeniable that Guevara was dead, so that no one could ever claim he was still out there in the mountains, still fighting, still coming. Doctors in white coats stood over the body. Officers posed beside it, and the local people of Grande came to look at the dead stranger laid out on the washing slab, and a great many of them did not see a defeated bandit at all. They saw something else. A Bolivian photographer named Freddy Alborta was there, and the pictures he took that day are among the most famous photographs of the 20th century. In them, Che Guevara lies on the concrete with his torso bare and his chest marked by the wounds, his head slightly raised on the lip of the trough, his hair and beard wild, and his eyes, strangely, not quite closed. He seems to be gazing out faintly at the people gathered around him. And almost everyone who saw the image, then and ever since, was struck by the same uncanny resemblance. He looked like the dead Christ. He looked like the lowered body in 100 old religious paintings, the martyr taken down and laid out to be mourned. Observers compared the photograph directly to Renaissance masterpieces of the dead Christ and to an old Rembrandt painting of a body on an anatomist's table. The men who had killed Guevara to destroy a legend had instead produced, in a hospital laundry, a perfect icon of martyrdom and handed it to the world. Think about what that photograph actually did, because it is central to everything that came after. The army had brought the press to Grande in order to kill a legend, and instead they staged its birth. A photograph of a defeated bandit would have been forgotten inside a week. This was not that. This was a beautiful, terrible image of a serene, dead face, the eyes not quite closed, ringed by uniformed men, and it asked every single person who looked at it a question the army had never meant to ask. Not, is he dead, but what did they do to him, and what was he, that they were so frightened of him? The picture traveled the world in a matter of days, onto front pages on every continent, and it did not say, "Here lies a criminal who got what he deserved." It said, "Here lies a martyr." The composition, the light, the open eyes, all of it spoke the old visual language of sacrifice that hangs in every gallery and church across the Western world, and people felt it long before they could have explained it. The men in Grande had wanted proof of an ending. What they made, and could never unmake, was the icon of a beginning. The townspeople sensed it before the art critics did. Some of the local women filing past were said to have cut small locks of the dead man's hair to keep, the way one keeps the relic of a saint. The body that was meant to be proof of an ending was already, on the very first day, becoming an object of veneration. The authorities watched it happen, and it frightened them. They had wanted a corpse that closed the story. Instead, they had a shrine forming around a washing trough, and so they made a second decision, and it is this second decision that gives our story its darkest and most lasting cruelty. They decided that Che Guevara must disappear, completely. No grave that could be found, no marker that could become a place of pilgrimage, nowhere for the faithful to come and kneel. If a tomb of Che Guevara existed anywhere on earth, they understood, it would become holy ground, and the legend would feed on it forever. So there would be no tomb, there would be nothing. But they had a practical problem. If the body simply vanished, how would anyone ever prove it had really been Guevara who died, and not some double, some trick, some staged announcement? They needed evidence of identity that would outlast the body itself. And so, before they made him disappear, they took the proof from him. A doctor cut off both of his hands. The hands were preserved in a jar of formaldehyde so that the fingerprints could later be matched against the records that proved who this man was. A cast of his face was reportedly made as well. The hands and the face were the receipt. And then the body, mutilated of the very hands that had signed orders and held rifles and filled that diary, was taken away in secret, in the dark, along with the bodies of several of his dead comrades, and put into an unmarked pit where no one would think to look. Stop and feel the full shape of that decision, because it is the thing the title of this film has been pointing at all along. It was not enough to kill him. They had killed him by 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The body still had to be solved, and the solution they reached was to take the most photographed dead man in the world and erase him from the earth, while keeping just enough of him in a jar to prove later that the erasure had been real. They cut the hands from a corpse so that fingerprints could one day confirm the corpse had existed. They denied him the one thing that every human being, saint or monster, is finally granted, which is a known grave. There would be no stone, no name, no patch of ground where a mother or a comrade or a curious stranger could one day stand and be sad. He would be nowhere. And the men who decided this were not cackling villains. They were frightened officials doing what frightened officials do, trying to control a dead man because they had failed to control the living one. They did not understand that you cannot bury a symbol in the ground, and that an empty, denied grave is not an absence at all. It is a question that refuses to stop being asked. For Smatawan Hapinginams, the hiding place they chose a piece of ground that was hidden in plain sight, the dirt airstrip at the edge of Valle Grande. In the early hours, a truck carried the bodies out to the airstrip, and they were buried beneath it, and the earth was closed over them, and the secret was kept. Officially, there was no grave at all. The government told different stories at different times, that the body had been cremated, that it had been buried somewhere undisclosed, that it hardly mattered. The truth, that Che Guevara and several of his men lay together in a mass grave under an airstrip, with his severed hands sitting in a jar somewhere else entirely, was held tight by the small number of soldiers who had done the work, and it would stay held against all the searching and the speculation and the legend swelling year by year for almost 30 years. So leave him there for a moment, in the unmarked ground beneath the airstrip, and let us see what became of the others, because the years did strange things to almost everyone who touched this story. René Barrientos, the president who had given the order, did not have long to enjoy the silence he had bought. Less than 2 years later, in April of 1969, his helicopter struck power cables in a narrow canyon and went down, and he was killed. The official finding was an accident, the ordinary danger of flying low through bad terrain, and it very likely was exactly that. But you will not be surprised to learn that in a country full of people who had loved the man he killed, not everyone chose to believe it. Felix Rodriguez, the CIA man, lived a long life and never stopped telling the story. He kept Guevara's steel Rolex and spoke of it openly for decades, the trophy of that morning in the schoolhouse. He went on to other operations in other wars and to a comfortable old age, and he gave interviews into his 80s about the day he watched the Bolivians kill the most famous revolutionary in the world, against his own agency's wishes. He has never shown much doubt about any of it. The handful of guerrillas who had fought their way clear of the ravine carried their own endings out into the years. Most of them went on living the cause that had so nearly killed them. One of the Bolivian survivors, the man called Inti, tried to rebuild the shattered movement and was hunted down and killed less than 2 years later. Others lived for decades. They grew old and wrote their memoirs and became, in time, the keepers of the story, the last living men who could say what the marches and the camps and the final morning had really been like. The revolution they had crossed the world to ignite never came. But they had walked out of a sealed ravine that swallowed nearly everyone else, and they spent the rest of their lives as its witnesses. And Mario Terán, the trembling sergeant who pulled the trigger, vanished into a long obscurity. He lived for decades under a changed name in the city of Santa Cruz, an ordinary man with a wife and children, carrying something inside him that the witnesses said had marked him from the moment he did it. And then, near the end of his life, the story handed him one final, almost unbelievable turn. In old age, Terán went nearly blind from cataracts, and in 2007 it was reported that his sight had been restored by a team of doctors working for free among the poor of Bolivia, doctors who had been sent there as part of a medical mission organized by the government of Cuba. The man who killed Che Guevara had his eyes opened again by the country Che Guevara had helped to build. He died in 2022. Make of that what you will. I find I cannot decide whether it is forgiveness or only a very long irony, and I have stopped trying to. The diary, those pages Rodriguez had photographed, made its own journey. A copy was smuggled out of Bolivia and reached Cuba, and the following year Fidel Castro published it to the world. The private ledger of the failed campaign became an international bestseller, the dead man narrating his own defeat in his own hand, and it only deepened the legend. And the famous face, the one I began with tonight, came from a photograph taken years earlier by a Cuban photographer named Corda, a single frame of Guevara at a memorial, gazing out from under a beret. Before his death it was little known. After his death it became, by many counts, the most reproduced photograph in the history of the world, raised on the walls and the flags and the shirts of people who very often could not have told you a single true thing about the man beneath it. They had killed him to end him. They had displayed his body to prove he was finished. And every single step they took to bury him only pressed his image deeper into the century. But the body itself, the real remains beneath the airstrip, stayed lost. For nearly 30 years Bolivia denied that any such grave existed. The faithful came to Grande and found nothing to kneel beside. And then, at last, an old soldier's conscience cracked the secret open. In 1995, a retired Bolivian general named Mario Vargas Salinas, who had been there in 1967, told an American journalist researching Guevara's life that he knew where the body lay. It was buried, he said, near the Grande airstrip. Enough time had passed, he felt. It was time the world knew. His words set off a search. Teams of forensic scientists, including Cuban and Argentine experts, came to Grande and began to dig along the old airstrip, looking for a grave the government had spent decades insisting did not exist. It took most of 2 years, and then, in the middle of 1997, they found it. A pit beside the airstrip, holding several skeletons, buried together, hidden under the dirt where the planes had been landing for 30 years. One of those skeletons was missing both of its hands. Dating was how they knew. The very mutilation that had been meant to erase his identity became the thing that confirmed it. The handless skeleton was Che Guevara. His remains were lifted out of the Bolivian ground at last and flown to Cuba, and in October of 1997, 30 years almost to the week after the schoolhouse, he was buried again, this time with full military honors and an enormous public mourning, in a great memorial in the city of Santa Clara, the city he had captured at the very end of 1958 to win the Cuban Revolution. The place where his story had crested, in the end became the place where it was laid to rest. I told you at the beginning, that the men who killed him failed in the strangest way a thing can fail, and now you can see the whole shape of it. They did everything right by their own cold logic. They cornered him. They took him alive. They made the calculated choice to kill rather than risk a living legend. They staged the death as a battle. They displayed the proof. They cut off his hands for certainty, and they hid the body where no one could ever come to mourn. Every step was designed to make Che Guevara stop mattering, and every single step made him matter more. The execution gave the world a martyr. The photograph gave the world an icon. The hidden grave gave the world a mystery. And then, when it finally opened, a kind of resurrection, complete down to the missing hands. I want to be careful as I leave you, the way I tried to be careful in the middle. The argument about the man himself is not closed, and it will not close in our lifetimes. The doctor who rode across a continent and gave up his power for the poor was real. So was the commander at La Cabana who sent men to the wall and did not flinch. You are allowed to hold both of them, and you are allowed to land wherever your conscience lands. But the thing that was done to him, the killing of a bound and wounded prisoner on a coded order, the staging of "it is a lie," the cutting and the hiding of the body, that part is not an argument. That part is simply what happened, and it is the part I think that does the haunting, not because of who he was, but because of what it shows. What frightened men in power will do to a body, and how completely it can fail to accomplish the one thing they were trying to do. Before I let you go, I am genuinely curious about one thing, and you can tell me in the comments, which I do read. By the end of tonight, where did you come down on him? Not on what they did to him, but on the man, the saint or the executioner, or the impossible both at once. I find people surprise themselves when they actually sit with the whole of a life instead of the slogan on the shirt. I would like to know where you landed. There are other men and other graves that the official record would still rather we left alone, and on some future night we will go and find one of them. For now, that is where I will leave him, and you. Sleep if you came here to sleep. Think if you came here to think. Either way, I am glad you stayed with me the whole way down. Good night.